Hey everyone, it's Susan Pierce Thompson and welcome to the weekly vlog. This week I want to talk to you about the Susceptibility Quiz and your susceptibility score, and a little bit about the history of the quiz and a little bit about some changes that we have made to the quiz and why. So the history of the Susceptibility Quiz is that I was writing information for my email list about how important it is to know how susceptible your brain is to the pull of those addictive foods like sugar and flour. Because there's some people who can tootle along in their lives eating small servings of ice cream and losing interest, eating some pie on Thanksgiving, and staying lean and happy, thin, and free, and not being derailed by eating sugar or flour at all. And then there's others of us, like me, who have a very different experience with those foods and with food in general. And we don't really get satisfied when we eat, and we frequently experience the feeling of losing control over how much we eat when we start eating. We can promise ourselves we're gonna have one slice or one piece or, one serving, and we don't. We start eating, and all of a sudden we're rationalizing having more and more. And we're thinking about food more than we wish we did. We're thinking about what we've eaten or not eaten, when we're going to eat again, how much we have to exercise to burn off what we have eaten. And it just feels like a big hamster wheel that we're kind of running around on in our head. And it's upsetting, and it takes up more than our lives than we wish it did. And some of us experience really painful binges and have health consequences because of our weight and all of that stuff. So, I feel like it's really important for people to know where they are on this continuum, and also to understand that it is a continuum. I mean, there are 12-step food programs that talk about being a food addict as if it's a binary distinction, as if the world can just be cut up into food addicts and non-food addicts. And I disagree. I think that there's a continuum there, and that there are people, on the susceptibility scale from 1 to 10 who are like in the 4, 5, 6, 7 range, where they may not identify themselves personally as a full-blown food addict, but they might experience the pull of addictive foods to an extent that it derails their weight loss efforts, it derails their attempts at getting healthy. And if they don't know that that's where they are on the scale, they're not going to be armed with enough information to, adopt a program strong enough to address that. So, I started sending out information about this on my email list for fun and for free 2 years ago, and people very quickly started writing back and saying, like, do you have a quiz or some kind of instrument that measures where you are on the susceptibility scale, because I want to know. And I said no, and I realized I needed to develop one. So I worked on the quiz. It was pretty easy to come up with the elements of it. I mean, being a 10 on the susceptibility scale myself, I know what's involved there. I know through brutal experience how my relationship with food differs from, say, my husband's relationship with food, or, my friend Ron's relationship with food, or my friend John's relationship with food, or I have lots of friends who are low on the susceptibility scale, and I've watched over the years, like, how they react to food and how I react to food is just very different. So it wasn't hard to come up with the dimensions, and it wasn't hard to come up with the questions. And what I did was I just set the scoring. There's 5 questions, and I wanted the quiz to be simple, and it is. It's very simple. There's only 5 questions. And I set the scoring matrix so that, your score is basically an average of how you answered on those 5 questions. Now, I knew there's some a priori evidence that the general population should come out to be about 1/3 low, 1/3 medium, and 1/3 high. And there's 3 lines of evidence for that. One is from a book called The End of Overeating. In that book, David Kessler talks about, he doesn't use the word food addiction, but it's basically what he's talking about. And he talks about a survey that was done and some data that were collected that showed essentially a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 split. Another line of evidence comes from the Yale Food Addiction Scale. And they have shown about 19% of the population testing out as food addicts. I would consider food addicts to be 9s and 10s on the susceptibility scale. If you extrapolate that out, that falls right in line with a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. If 1/3 of the population gets, say, like an 8, 9, or 10, or 7, 8, 9, and 10, it kind of depends on whether you call a 7 high or not on the scale. But 19% as being food addicts, I think, is within that realm of a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 split. The other line of evidence comes from rats, and I talk about it in the food freedom videos, where I talk about 1/3 of rats are not addictable, and 1/3 are very addictable, and 1/3 are somewhere in between. So as people took the susceptibility quiz, it was showing that about 1/3 were high, 1/3 were medium, and 1/3 were low, and we thought all was cool in the gang. So as I was writing my book recently, I decided to start taking some more measures to validate the susceptibility quiz. And as I was doing that, one of my first steps was to contract with an independent company to randomly sample the American population and let me know whether we got this nice 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 split. Because I know that the people who come take my quiz from my stuff, like from an email they've received or from my website, that's not a random sample of the population. Those are people who are probably higher than average on the susceptibility scale because they're drawn in by a message. Are you addicted to food? It's going to be more often food addicts that are going to be going, oh, I think I want to find out. So I knew we needed to get a random sample of the population, and I knew I didn't have access to a random sample. It's actually really hard to get a random sample of the population. You can't, there aren't phone books anymore really, and you can't use driver's license records, or it's really hard to get a random sample of the population. So anyway, there's companies that specialize in this. We paid them a bunch of money. They went out and they randomly sampled, I think it was like 1,300 people. They got demographic information, made sure their sample was really random. And when they sent back the results, it was not evenly distributed. The way we were scoring the susceptibility quiz was highly skewed toward the bottom side of the scale. Meaning, I should have looked up the exact percentages before I recorded this video, but it was something like 40 to 45%, maybe 45% of the population were low, like 1, 2, or 3 on the susceptibility scale. Almost 45% were medium, like 4, 5, or 6, and something like 10% were high. And of the 10s, it was like 0.5% scored 10 on the susceptibility scale, as opposed to the 10% that we would like to see. If the Yale Food Addiction Scale shows 19% being food addicts, I would like to see 19% or 20% of the population getting a 9 or a 10 on the susceptibility quiz. And that's not what we were finding at all. We were getting maybe 1 or 2%. So I huddled my research team together. We started thinking about this. I started thinking about it really deeply, and I started to realize what I think is going on. So the quiz itself is fine, but the scoring rubric of the quiz needs to be updated. And here's some of the additional sort of psychological backdrop to why that actually makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense because, first of all, when you take the quiz, you get 5 questions and you can answer from 1 to 5. Like, how much is it a problem for you that you lose control over how much you eat when you stop eating? On a Likert scale from 1 to 5. Well, if you answer 4 or 5 to that, that's a problem, right? How vicious and frequent are your binges? Never, or super frequent and super vicious, right? On a scale from 1 to 5. If you score 4 or 5 on that, that's a problem. How much are you obsessed with food and what you've eaten or not eaten? How much of your life does it take up that you wish it didn't take up on a scale from 1 to 5? If you answer a 4 or 5 on that, that's a problem. And do you see that these are all independent problems? Like, if you lose control of how much you eat, it doesn't matter if you binge or not. Like, that's a problem irrespective of whether you're binging. If you are obsessed with food 24/7, it doesn't matter if when you actually eat, you perfectly control your portions. If you're obsessed with it at every other moment, that's a problem. So what's interesting is that each of these 5 questions, any high answer on any of the 5 means you've got a big problem. So let's say an answer pattern of like 2, 2, 2, 5, 5, that person's got a problem if they answer 2, 2, 2, 5, 5 on the 5 questions. And we needed a scoring rubric that reflects that an answer pattern of 2, 2, 2, 5, 5, even though it only adds up to 16, is a very different answer pattern to like, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, right? It's a very different answer pattern. So what we needed to do was to score the quiz in a way that reflects that. There's also the issue of psychological space. In other words, like how big are the buckets of the 1 on the susceptibility scale, the 2 on the susceptibility scale, the 3 on the susceptibility scale, all the way up to 10, right? And the answer is that the buckets actually need to get bigger as you climb up the scale. And the reason that the buckets need to get bigger is that there's a lot more psychological distance between people at the higher end of the scale. So what I mean by that is, at the lower end of the scale, there's a lot of homogeneity, meaning 1s on the susceptibility scale all relate to food in pretty much the same way, meaning they don't think about it much. They're not dealing with it much. It's not an issue in their lives. When their tummy rumbles, they find something to eat. Not too long after starting to eat, they're losing interest in food and they move on with their lives. It's a very similar experience for people who are a 1 on the susceptibility scale. There's not a lot of variety or difference in that experience, meaning this should be a small bucket on the quiz. It's like a contained packet. As you move up the scale, when you start to get into the 7, 8, 9 range, the range of ways that people vary in their food and the distance between each other gets immense. There's all kinds of ways that people can be crazy about food, and there's all kinds of extremes in that as well. In other words, the psychological space on the higher end of the susceptibility scale is bigger. So what we've done to rectify the situation is we've created a scoring rubric that involves more the square of the numbers than the numbers themselves. And it's complicated, there's math involved, my research team is on it, but this is what we came to through our validity testing of the scale. Now, with the new way that it's scored, we get exactly what we should get, which is validated against the other research that's out there. We get just about an even spread across the susceptibility scale with a random sample of people from the population, as opposed to the people that find their way to my website to take the quiz. What this means for you is that if you take the susceptibility quiz again, you might get a different score, and it might be a little bit higher. And one of the reasons I think this is a good thing is that we have had people in our community doing our boot camp who scored past tense, a 5 or a 6 or a 7 on the susceptibility scale, and that now they think they're a 5 or a 6 or a 7. And after the boot camp, they think, well, I'm only a 6. I'll try eating off my plan at Halloween or at Thanksgiving or whatever. And what they're finding is that it's really hard to get back. And their brains are not behaving like they're a 6. Their brains are behaving like they're an 8 or a 9 or a 10. And what our old way of scoring the quiz was not reflecting the psychological reality of how people were actually struggling with food after the boot camp, if they assumed that it would be easy to get back on track, and it's not. So I think that this new scoring mechanism, although if you've taken the quiz before and you take it again now and you get a different number, I invite you to be open-minded about that, because odds are this new score that you're getting is much more reflective of the psychological reality of what you're going to experience in your food journey if you start monkeying around with your bright lines. For what it's worth, my friends Marianne and Lyndon in my mastermind group, who were like, I'm only a 9 on the susceptibility scale. Girlfriends, I think you're now going to be a 10. Just saying. So anyway, I invite you to take the quiz again. We're providing a link here. And yeah, we will continue to validity test and reliability test this instrument. Science is a work in progress. I'm not even going to apologize for not getting everything perfect the first go round, because that's just not life. Bright line eating is a place where we get to be imperfect. So I did not score the susceptibility quiz perfectly the first time, and I will admit that. And to the extent that that causes you any distress, for that I apologize. But I wanted to give you the full backstory of why we changed our scoring algorithm, and to invite you to take the quiz again if you'd like. And that's the weekly vlog. So if you have something you want me to talk about on the weekly vlog, go ahead and send it in. I'm at susan@brightlineeating.com. I'll see you next week.